Welcome. Thank you for joining this South Center briefing. My name is Viviana Munoz. I coordinate the Health, Intellectual Property and Biodiversity program at the South Center, and I will be the moderator for the session. This meeting relates to the proposal under discussion in the Council for the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights of the World Trade Organization for a temporary waiver to certain provisions of the TRIPS Agreement for purposes of the prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID-19. That is WTO document IP/C/W/669, additional 1, correction 1. This meeting is held on the 9th of November. The meeting aims to further inform delegations to the WTO and capital-based officials, also provide clarifications, and allow for frank exchange on the terms and implications of the waiver in order to increase the support for the proposal with additional co-sponsorship. Increasing the number of co-sponsors for the proposal will strengthen the position of the group in favor of the waiver to seek agreement at the reconvened session of the Council for TRIPS later this month for forwarding it to the General Council for its consideration. This meeting will be recorded for the panel section. So I have the pleasure to introduce our excellent panel. Ms. Gurleen Kaur, Second Secretary, Permanent Mission of India to the WTO. Dr. Mustaqim Degama, Counselor, Permanent Mission of South Africa to the WTO and UN. Dr. Carlos Correa, Executive Director, South Center. Dr. Yusuf Vavda, Professor of Law, School of Law, University of KwaZulu-Natal. Dr. Hu Yong-kyung, Policy Coordinator, Medicine Sans Frontières Access Campaign. Ms. Pascale Boulet, IP and Access Leader, the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, DNDi. Ms. Gurleen Kaur, I will start by asking you, can you please explain what was the motivation for the waiver proposal and what is the urgency?
In many parts of the world, there are no signs yet of the pandemic abating anytime soon. So when you say what motivated the need for this waiver proposal, so the concept of the waiver emerged actually in early stages of the pandemic. So in the months of March and April, when several countries were facing acute supply shortages of many medical products such as ventilators, medical equipment, PPEs, etc. There were reports from different countries showing that the real concerns that intellectual property rights hinder the response to COVID-19. Few initial examples of intellectual property rights becoming a barrier in scaling up the production were on buffers used in test kits, the ventilator valves, etc. So it became clearly apparent that the concern that IP is a barrier to access, it was applicable to both the existing products as well as the products in pipeline. Many of the repurposed drugs are patent protected in different countries, and exclusive voluntary licensing has failed to address their supply shortages. So amid all this international emergency situation, the thinking about the waiver emerged. So it was felt that the remedies available under the TRIPS agreement are not adequate to address the fast changing landscape of COVID-19. So why do I say so? Because we have a limited policy space available under the TRIPS agreement to address the egregious reactions
enfrentarnos a estas acciones.
of compulsory licenses. But this policy space would not be a feasible option in the pandemic of this scale and magnitude. Invoking compulsory licenses across a wide range of medical products, and that too on a country-by-country, case-by-case, and product-by-product basis, is a cumbersome and time-consuming process, severely limiting their effectiveness in the context of products and technologies required for handling COVID-19.
Excuse me, Gurleen, to pause you just a moment. Could you please try to speak a little bit louder for our French participants are having a bit trouble to hear for the interpretation. Thank you.
So I was saying that the medical technologies required for COVID-19 response are protected by multiple IPs. And the understanding and implementation of the TRIPS flexibilities in the IPs other than patents are limited. So that limits the options available with developing countries to promote rapid scale up of local manufacturing. And furthermore, most countries do not have the necessary infrastructure or experience to use the existing TRIPS flexibilities. Many developing and least developed countries do not have the manufacturing capacity, and neither they have the institutional capacities to issue compulsory licenses. And Article 31 bis of the TRIPS agreement, which allows export to such countries who have insufficient or no manufacturing capacity, is subject to extremely cumbersome and lengthy procedures, rendering it meaningless and impractical to use. So it was therefore felt very important that there is a need to revisit the legal framework for protection of inventions, because COVID-19 is a threat to the world at large, and no country can be immune to its effect. An inability of even one country to address the pandemic due to patent protection can have negative externality for the entire world. So, in the effort towards an effective response to COVID-19, our ultimate goal is not only to produce a safe and effective vaccine, but the goal is to bring the pandemic to an end. And that can happen only after billions of doses are produced affordably and made available to everyone, and particularly to those in low and middle income countries. So, therefore, when the first safe and effective vaccines and treatments emerge, we need to ensure that multiple manufacturers can
Vacunas,
immediately start producing them
los
simultaneously.
fabricantes han de producirlas lo antes posible.
And so as to ensure that this our waiver proposal aims to remove intellectual property barriers and promote transfer of technology. The waiver will remove legal uncertainties, and it will create freedom to operate and collaborate for scaling up the production of COVID-19 products, thereby facilitating timely, equitable, and affordable access to such products for all. So, Viviana, I would also like to give a short state of play as to where the proposal stands at present. So, the proposal was as co-sponsored by India, South Africa, Kenya, and Eswatini, was introduced at the TRIPS Council during the session held on 15-16 October. And the proposal received enthusiastic response at the TRIPS Council meeting. Around 40 members engaged in substantive discussion, which lasted more than 3 hours. And out of these, 30 members and observers expressed support for the issue, with 15 members explicitly supporting the proposal from floor, and the rest welcomed constructive engagement on the proposal while awaiting feedback from their respective capitals. And the proposal also received broad-based support from international organizations like WHO, UNAIDS, MSF, DNDi, and various other civil society organizations. So what the waiver proposal does is it opens space for further collaboration, for transfer of technology, and for more producers to come in to ensure that we have scalability in a much shorter period of time, which is the need of the hour. So once the production of vaccines and therapeutics is scaled up, it will lead to their timely and affordable access in those developing and least developed countries who may not have the wherewithal to sign advance purchase agreements with a limited number of suppliers. So this is a temporary waiver that will last for a specific period as agreed by the General Council, and it will thereafter be reviewed annually by the members until its termination. For taking this proposal to its logical conclusion, it would be important that as many as possible members co-sponsor and support it. Last but not the least, I would say that given the global hardship arising from the pandemic, all members have a shared responsibility to translate into reality the promises of vaccines as a global public good by ensuring that the scientific benefits of the research that they fund from public money are shared as widely as possible to protect people's lives, livelihoods, and healths. I therefore request all members present here to support the adoption of this waiver at the TRIPS Council in the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you, Gurleen, for giving us that first expression of what is the waiver and also the state of play. Mustaqim, could I invite you to come in and now explain some of the elements are contained in the proposal and what are the expectations moving forward now in this next month for the waiver? And just before you start speaking, could I please remind our distinguished panelists, since we have translation, if you could please slow down so that therefore we can ensure that in Spanish and French they can follow us appropriately. Thank you. So Mustaqim, to you.
Yes, thank you, Viviana. I'd like to thank the South Center for convening this very important discussion on the TRIPS waiver. And I think as my colleague Gurleen indicated, we have submitted this to the TRIPS Council for an initial round of discussion. And maybe just for consistency, there has been a date which has now been set, and this would be for the 20th of November. And so just carrying on from the request made by Gurleen, it's really for members to consider this and to try to co-sponsor in as big a number as would be possible. From that point of view, Viviana, I'd just like to quickly speak to some issues pertaining to our proposal. I think Gurleen did a very good job just outlining why we felt that a proposal like this was necessary, given the international emergency that exists under this pandemic. We believe that both the letter and the spirit of the TRIPS agreement must be complied with. As she would have indicated, it's not always so straightforward to invoke the TRIPS flexibilities. And so the waiver really provides us an opportunity to easily invoke these flexibilities without necessarily having to go product by product, license by license, but in order to address the pandemic as it stands currently. And so from that point of view, Viviana, we had proposed that the waiver be granted to all WTO members. And I want to stress, this is a waiver that is open to all WTO members, whether they are developed or developing country members. We've seen that all members have been affected by shortages, by access to essential medicines, but also the necessary equipment, diagnostic tools, and personal protective gear that would be required. So it's important to stress that this is open to all members, and we've asked for this particular waiver to be granted so that our members do not have to implement, apply, or enforce obligations related to COVID-19 products and technologies under Section 1, which relates to copyright and related rights, Section 4, which relates to industrial designs. We have also previously demonstrated a few examples of where industrial designs may constitute barriers to access. Section 5, which deals with patents, which Gurleen has already spoken about, at least the Article 31 first section, and then importantly also Section 7 of Part 2 of the TRIPS agreement. And so from that point of view, we do not believe that COVID-19 applies in an unlimited way to everything. We have suggested that it does not apply beyond what is necessary for prevention, containment, and treatment. Viviana, I also very quickly want to stress the point that the waiver does not imply any substantive changes to any treaty obligations. So it is only a temporary suspension of the operation of the items which had been requested to be suspended for a period which will be agreed by members. Now, a second very important element of our proposal is that it is definitely time-bound. And so from that point of view, in terms of the scope, we've already indicated that it certainly would be a limited, necessary reaction to the consequences of COVID-19. But as my colleague would also have indicated, the waiver will continue to apply until widespread vaccination is in place globally and the majority of the world's population has developed immunity. And so hence we propose a duration of X years from the date of adoption of the waiver. This merely means that we place it in the hands of members to decide how long this will be. One of the considerations would be how long the waiver would prevail, but also how long it would take for us to have effective access to any prophylactics that may be produced during this time. And so from that point of view, Viviana, we would still probably have to have a discussion on how this would work. Now, given the fact that we want more people to produce whatever it is required, we may want to decide on a realistic time frame for domestic producers to be able to make the necessary investments and to be able to produce to the scale that would be required. And so from that point of view, in terms of time frames, anything between 5 to 10 years, depending on how the situation evolves. Now, this may sound excessive, but certainly when you think of the development of a vaccine, on average takes in excess of 10 years. With the current situation, we also face not only a limited number of producers that are able to produce, but also scaling up the production is going to be quite novel. And then also all the other infrastructure issues that may be applicable. So it may be quite a long time before members actually have effective access to vaccines or any other biologicals, pharmaceuticals, and certainly also equipment that would be required to address the virus. So from that point of view, Viviana, I think we would want to stress the importance of having enough time to prepare ourselves. The virus is not going away. If we look at the last few weeks and the rates of infection, this is not something that will be treated by the end of the year or by the end of next year. And so from that point of view, we believe that, that the solution proposed by the waiver is something that all members should consider and should try to support as we move forward to a more substantive discussion. I leave it at that, Viviana, and would be happy to address some questions a little bit later.
Thank you, Mustaqim. So just before I turn to Professor Correa, Mustaqim, can you just again highlight for us, so what are the next steps forward in terms of where the proposal is now? What are the next steps?
Yes, so the next step is to reconvene the TRIPS Council. So I just wanted to indicate that since we invoked Article 93A, the item on the waiver was suspended, which means that the TRIPS Council is still in session in respect of this particular item. So the TRIPS Council in full session will be reconvened. And us as proponents, we may want to firstly present any new co-sponsors. Secondly, there were certain questions that were posed at the closing of our meeting. And so we may want to come back with some more responses and clarification. And so the objective of the meeting is really to try and address some of the questions. You will also recall that there were around 40 delegations that took the floor. At least 30 of them were supportive of the proposal. Around half of that had unrestricted support, and the other half had certain questions, had posed questions, wanted certain clarifications. So we will also use this opportunity to come back and to clarify the matter, and hopefully on that basis we can build further consensus in terms of where we could move with the waiver. What I also wanted to say, another procedural step is that nonetheless, irrespective of what happens, the General Council is also expecting to receive a report on the discussion of the waiver at its next session, which is planned for December. So based on how it may go on the 20th, we are also looking at maybe convening a follow-up meeting to build out the support and certainly to create more consensus, perhaps around this particular proposal. I hope that's clear, Viviana.
Thank you, Mustaqim. So Professor Correa, wanted to come to you now. I think one question that's very important that many are asking is, can we have more ideas about concretely what are some of the problems that the waiver might help countries address?
Okay, well, thank you for organizing this meeting. So welcome to all. We hope really to welcome you soon in our new premises of the South Center at the Parliament House 2. But given the limitation of time, let me just focus on the question that has been raised. So what are the problems that this waiver are addressing? I would mention two substantive problems and one kind of procedural problem. The first substantive problem is the need to expand manufacturing capacity in order to address the COVID-19 crisis. This is particularly true for vaccines, as we know, but it's also true for equipment or diagnostic kits. But let me just give us an example of the situation of vaccines. As we know, if there is a possibility of controlling this disease, it will be necessary to get vaccination to the world population. So this means to get vaccines for 7.8 billion people. And if there is a need of 2 doses, this means that it is necessary to produce more than 15 billion doses of the vaccine in a short time. This requires then access to technology. This requires to expand the manufacturing capacity. And in order to do this, it is necessary to have the tools, and the waiver is one of these tools, in order to be able to use the technology that may allow the production of vaccines or other products which is necessary to address this disease. So this is one essential issue. And it was mentioned by Mustaqim, these investments take time. So time is crucial in relation to this initiative. There is a need to urgently expand the capacity for manufacture equipment, diagnostic kits and vaccines and treatments when they are actually identified. But then these investments will mature over time, and therefore it is necessary to start working from now in order to ensure that this happens within a time limit that prevents this disease to continue spreading. So the second problem that this waiver will address is access to products. So I was referring to situations in which there is possibility of expanding manufacturing capacity. This may not be at hand for many countries, but many countries will need to get access to the products which are necessary to address this disease. And then the situation is such that even if in a particular country, for instance, a least developed country, there is no patent protection because the waiver applies in least developed countries. The fact is that if there is no waiver in the potential exporting countries, these other countries will not be able to get vaccines or diagnostic tools or equipment. So this is not only necessary in order to get access to technology for the countries that can actually expand manufacturing capacity, which is absolutely needed today, but it's also crucial for those countries that lack this manufacturing capacity, but will not be able to get access to affordable products, as we mentioned before by Gorlin, if this waiver is not adopted. And then there is a third type of problem, which is procedural, was already mentioned also by Gorlin Kaur. And this is the fact that although there are flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement, in particular the compulsory licensing, the use of these flexibilities may not be enough in order to timely respond to the needs that this pandemic is presenting to developing countries in particular. The compulsory licenses are subject to particular procedural terms, some conditions, and there may be a need to speed up these processes. For instance, in some countries, if compulsory license is granted, there might be a possibility for the patent owner to appeal, and then this may delay the execution of the compulsory license, and therefore this waiver will allow governments that wish to do so to act in a timely manner in order to address this situation. I've noticed that in the debate of the last Council for TRIPS, there has been some references, for instance, by the European Union about the respect of the flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement, including the compulsory license. However, what we know is that in cases, for instance, such as Thailand, when Thailand decided to grant compulsory license, the European Commission was one that put a lot of pressure against this decision by the Thai government. More recently, in the case of Colombia, when the Minister of Health attempted to get a compulsory license in relation to imatinib, there was very strong pressure by the United States, for instance, in order to prevent this from happening. So this waiver will allow to speed up procedures, and very importantly, will allow to protect against pressure by some governments for governments in the South, in developing countries in particular, not to act. So this is of particular importance. At the Council for TRIPS session, the delegation of South Africa actually mentioned that the European Commission has produced a report earlier this year in which some countries are qualified as not complying with the desired standards for intellectual property in relation to compulsory license. As we know, the special section 301 of the US Trade Act is used also as a tool in order to put pressure on governments not to use the three flexibilities, including compulsory license. On this, in fact, I did write a paper earlier this year. It was published in July this year. Is the research papers 115, in which I have made an analysis of the illegitimate use of the special section 301 in order to put pressure on countries not to use the three flexibility. So in fact, just to conclude this point, even in situations where developed countries do claim that they respect flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement, including compulsory license, this may not be reality what happens, and then the waiver will provide a very significant protection against these pressures.
Thank you, Professor Correa. That was very clear. There is also another general question that some colleagues have been asking with regards to assuming that the waiver proposal moves forward. What are the issues for domestic implementation? What are some of the options that country might have in accordance to their legal framework to implement? Is there a need as well to take some measures for domestic implementation? And is this at all a barrier?
Well, it's not a barrier as such. It will be the hands of each government to take the appropriate measures. What is clear, however, that a waiver, this is the case also for Article 73B of the TRIPS agreement that provides for an exception in case of national security. What is clear is that this waiver will just protect a particular government which desires to use it against complaints by other members of WTO. There may be a need to provide the necessary adjustments at the national level. This could be done through a law, this could be done through executive decree. It will be up to each government to do that. But then this will open, as was mentioned before also by Gorlin, the policy space to do that in a timely manner. And although these changes may be necessary, it will be just within the policy space that the waiver will allow for governments to do that. Let me just mention an interesting example, because one of the governments that clearly opposed to the waiver at the last TRIPS Council meeting is the United States. But interestingly, in the United States, even without the waiver, there is legislation which was adopted in 2005. This is called the PrEP Act. It is the Public Readiness and Preparedness Act that actually allows any manufacturer, distributor to be immune from any violation of state or federal laws, including in accordance to report produced in the United States intellectual property. So interestingly, in the United States, there is already domestic legislation that will allow, as I mentioned, manufacturers, distributors, or any other agents to violate intellectual property in order to address this emergency. And if you go to the website of the Department of Health, this PrEP Act is actually mentioned, spelled out, and the precedents are indicated there. So it will be up to the governments to act. Of course, a waiver will not force any government to do that, but it will provide the freedom, the policy space I mentioned before, to each government in order to act, in order to take the measures that are necessary in order to respond to this pandemic.
Thank you, Professor Correa. And as you've seen also, the Biden new government has highlighted that they will also see that the PrEP Act has an important role in the coming government. So following on that, Professor Correa, could you generally then tell us your perspective of will all countries, can they stand to benefit all countries from the waiver? Is it not only for countries with manufacturing capacities, or can this generally be of benefit for the broad membership despite their quite different situations?
Well, for sure, as I mentioned before, it's not only for countries with manufacturing capacity. It's for countries which need to receive products, we need to import products. These products will not exist, and in particular not exist at affordable prices if a measure like this is not taken in the potential exporting countries. So therefore, it's not just an issue for those with manufacturing capacities, but it's an issue for all countries. And maybe we may find a situation in which developed countries also benefit from it, as we have seen when this COVID-19 disease broke out. Countries such as Germany and Canada, they acted quite speedily in order to adopt legislation and facilitate the access to technologies covered by intellectual property. I will also join the comment made about Article 31 bis. Article 31 bis is really very cumbersome, so it does not provide the right solution to the situation that may arise if technology is necessary or access to technology or products is necessary. Therefore, I think this confirms the usefulness of a waiver and the fact that the current tools in the TRIPS agreement may not be sufficient to address in a timely manner the situation created by COVID-19.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Professor Yusuf Vavda. Yusuf, looking specifically at the African context and the fact that many of the countries are least developed countries as well in Africa, what do you think could be the value of the waiver in the African context?
Thank you, Viviana, and greetings to all participants and the panel. I would also like to thank South Center for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. Will the waiver benefit all countries? How does it impact Africa and so on, and least developed countries? Yes, I think the short answer is that all countries can benefit, as Professor Correa and others have already said. But I think that those countries without significant local manufacturing capacity can especially benefit. What we've seen during this current pandemic are huge shortages in most countries, even in developed countries, of health products due to the high demand, the limited supply, and things like disruptions in supply chain. Now, of course, some of this is because, nobody was ready for this pandemic, but I think a lot of the shortages are due to artificial considerations. In other words, things that are the result of the intensive protections that intellectual property receives under the TRIPS system, and which results in the exclusion of competitors from manufacturing what are essentially public goods, even during a pandemic. So to that extent, yes, we've seen shortages, I think somewhat artificially created because of the IP system. Turning to Africa, I think as in many sort of developing regions and so on, the pandemic exposed the highly inadequate capacity to manufacture and supply essential drugs and diagnostics and test kits and personal protective equipment and so on. Now, it is true that local manufacturing is weak on the continent, although pharmaceutical products are manufactured in many countries, such as South Africa and Kenya and Uganda, and Morocco and Egypt and so on. As a whole, Africa currently imports in the region of 80% of its pharmaceutical and medical consumables. And clearly, this is an unsustainable situation. So it's for this reason that, going back a little bit, in the Abuja summit in 2005, the Assembly of the African Union asked the Commission to develop a pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa, the PMPA, which was finalized a couple of years later in 2007. Despite some advances that have actually been made, most of the local production is confined to the packaging of finished products, or what is known as fill and finish, with limited manufacturing in the fullest sense of the word. So I guess the question that arises both for Africa and other developing regions is, how is the capacity to be built? Of course, there are many prerequisites for successful manufacturing, some of them already mentioned by Mr. Kim and Prof. Correa. Investment by government in the first instance and other global actors, the development of infrastructure and skills, and most importantly, I think, the meaningful technology transfer. In other words, the know-how to actually produce these essential items is presently very secretive and restricted to the IP holders. And unless that is shared, and unless there is a legal basis to demand sharing of that, the present situation will actually continue. And of course, the current IP system does not enable or promote any of this. So therefore, the waiver in that context has two advantages, I think some of which has already been mentioned, right? The one is that it will remove most of the barriers that will enable us to unlock manufacturing in places where there's very limited manufacturing capacity, by sharing knowledge and technology to enable African countries and other countries to develop the know-how to participate in the manufacturing process. So that's the one immediate advantage. But secondly, it will also, sorry, that's not an immediate advantage. That's the one advantage that will accrue if the investments are there, if the process is allowed to go forward. And secondly, immediately rather, it will enable countries that don't have local manufacturing capacity to immediately import from countries that are able to produce at scale and enable, proliferation of the treatments and vaccines and so on. And finally, on this point, will the benefits be limited to developing countries only and LDCs? No, certainly not, as I think has been explained. It's also poor people in developed countries, those who pay out of pocket for their medicines, either because the medicines are not available in the public facilities or because they don't have medical insurance. I think it also enables those people in those countries as well to access the vaccines and the treatments that are needed.
Thank you, Professor Vagda. Now, generally, another concern that has arisen is the relationship between the TRIPS flexibilities and the waiver. And I think we've already heard some of the panelists talking about the importance of both. Could you give us your view generally about the TRIPS flexibilities and the waiver? Is there any worry or concern about the use of the TRIPS flexibilities as we move forward with the waiver discussion?
Yes, thank you, Viviana. That's a very important question. And I'll try not to repeat what has been said by my fellow panelists. Let me just start by saying that, yes, I think I believe that the waiver is perfectly compatible with all the other TRIPS flexibilities. It does not undermine the other flexibilities in any way. It is complementary to what have been known as the existing or already available flexibilities. Also, as I think Mustaqim and others have said, it's a perfectly legal mechanism allowed by the TRIPS agreement. Nor is it a radical request or a special favor that is being asked, but merely members exercising their rights using the TRIPS framework. I think it's useful to think about flexibilities as a kind of a set of tools in a toolbox, where a different tool is used for a different sort of purpose. So for example, if a generic manufacturer wants to prepare for marketing of a product, once the patent on that product is expired, they will pick a particular flexibility, the BOLA exception as it is known, to go about getting regulatory approval so that they can market and compete once the patent expires. On the other hand, if a government finds that the pricing of a medicine is particularly excessive, it could use a different flexibility, namely the compulsory license or government use flexibility, to ensure that there is competition, there is production of at scale and at affordable cost that could become available. So similarly, the waiver is another level of flexibility, as I see it, that will enable us to respond more quickly in this pandemic by suspending those constraints on the use of knowledge, on sharing of technology, and so on. Of course, I won't talk about too much about the what the waiver requirements are, because that's already been explained, Article 9 of the Marrakesh Treaty and so on. But just to emphasize that the waiver is time limited, it's limited to specific products, that's COVID-19 related, and only to those specific IP protections that are listed in the proposal. But importantly, the waiver has global reach, unlike the flexibilities that we've talked about. The flexibilities have to be included in the national law of a country. And it can only be used for that particular item or product or drug, and usually after a fairly complicated legal process. Now, all of these things are barriers to actually the use of those flexibilities, whereas the advantage of the waiver is that it's a single action which makes it possible to be used everywhere. But importantly, as Professor Correa said, it must be made part of each country's law. It must be domesticated at that level. And also, importantly, that it ends with the COVID-19 pandemic. So the waiver will end there, but other flexibilities will remain. Also, the other flexibilities, the waiver is not limited to patents, but also, as people have pointed out, copyright, industrial designs, undisclosed data, trade secrets, industry know-how, and so on. And of course, is equally important, in addition to adopting the waiver, for countries to look at how they can adopt the flexibilities that are already there and already available. Because the pandemic will end at some point, but the problem of inaccessible and unaffordable medicines for other diseases and other health conditions is likely to be there for a long time. So what the waiver also does is that, in respect of expanding the range of flexibilities that countries can use, it gives them breathing space to be able to bring their laws up to speed, set up their institutions and the infrastructure to be able to do this. And this is particularly important because if you look at, for example, the LDC waiver, in Africa, there are some 33 countries who fall into the category of LDCs, least developed countries, which is about 60% of the continent. Yet there are many LDCs which continue to protect patents when they're not obliged to do that by the TRIPS agreement. So they're not using these flexibilities. And here is an opportunity for these mechanisms to be put in order. Other panelists have already talked about the challenges of using flexibility, so I won't go there, especially Article 31 verse, sorry. But of course, under the emergency conditions, the waiver is the best possible solution. It supports countries taking the road towards developing local manufacture, but also immediately enables them to import from countries that will be producing them. So the waiver, LDC, this particular waiver does not interfere or diminish the LDC waiver at all. It adds to it by including other protections like copyright and industrial design, which are not part of the LDC waiver. So that's an important difference. It's opening up the scope to a greater range of IP protections, which are acting as barriers to transfer of technology and sharing of knowledge. Of course, the LDC waiver continues to 2033 for pharmaceuticals, whereas this waiver might go on for a sort of shorter period. So there are those sorts of differences, but in sum, I think these are flexibilities which are complementary. They can work together side by side, and they could help us in this very dire pandemic situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. Pascal, I'd like to come to you now. You work with the Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, which works on product development. So a lot of experience with knowing what is the landscape and what are the constraints for building up and scaling up manufacturing capacity. So in this COVID situation, as everyone has mentioned, speed is really needed. It's the urgency of situation. We can't wait for 10 years. So based on what you've seen with DNDI's experience, how do you think the waiver might solve some of the issues or bottlenecks so far for building and scaling up manufacturing capacity, in particular, looking at capacities in developing countries?
Thank you, Viviana, and thank you for inviting DNDI to provide its perspective on such an important issue and proposal. So at DNDI, yes, we very much think the waiver will support local production and manufacturing capacity. Local manufacturers either cannot produce today because they are blocked by IP rights and owners will not want to license at all, or because the negotiations are too slow or with onerous terms that make all of this can make local production difficult and or untimely or unfeasible. It is clear that for any successful treatment to be available, there needs to be increased production and supply worldwide, as many panelists said before. So local production will be critical to this. And the waiver will mean that IP holders will concretely no longer be able to oppose such move from local manufacturers. The waiver will enable countries not to grant nor enforce patent rights or other rights, thereby providing full freedom to operate to local producers. So this means that the waiver will give certainty by de-risking any activity from local manufacturers, which will not be concerned with possible costly legal action or delay caused by IP holders claiming infringement of IP rights related to COVID technologies. Local manufacturers will not even have to do patent searches to see whether any of the related technologies are under patent protection. They can just forget about any IP infringements. And overall, as we said, the waiver will remove the need for local producers and countries to use compulsory license on a case-by-case basis. I mean, as was very clearly explained, thereby definitely speeding up the process and also potentially allowing easier regional production for countries without local capacity. So the waiver, we really see the waiver as, in effect, an opportunity to take concrete steps to ensure that COVID-19 drugs, diagnostic, vaccine, and any other health technologies are available as global public goods. There have been many speeches about the need for global public goods since the COVID-19 stroke, and we see this initiative as one way to materialize this very concretely.
Thank you, Pascal. We've also heard that there are, some saying, well, maybe the IP holders, based on their voluntary initiatives, they can pool technologies and their know-how. Do you think that would be sufficient? And looking at the evidence of what's happened so far, for example, also the initiative within the WHO of the CAP-T to try to develop this kind of voluntary pool, is that moving fast enough, well enough? What does that tell us? Can we rely on these voluntary measures, or is that not the case?
So fast enough, well enough, I think very little has happened yet in that regard. And so given the urgency of the situations, fast enough, clearly no. However, we think that it's important that these efforts continue in parallel, I would say, to this process, in addition to the waiver, in parallel to it. And I mean, IP rights holders should be encouraged to license their IP and know-how on a non-exclusive basis, whether through individual licenses or through CTAP, the WHO technology access pool, COVID technology access pool. The reason is that those companies may have data, knowledge that is confidential at the moment, and that may not be available through compulsory licenses or use of the waiver. So any incentive indeed to companies to openly share such data and knowledge will be welcome and will be useful, and can definitely speed up the local manufacturing, local production. I mean, as unfortunately, very few companies have committed to open sharing of IP, which is a shame given the billions provided by government to fund R&D for COVID-19. And unfortunately, even more, no company has contributed to the WHO CTAP pool. So yes, we, again, to summarize, the waiver is a unique opportunity to push for global public goods, but in parallel, it may be important that governments, all governments, increase pressure and demand to companies to share undisclosed knowledge and data.
Thank you, Pascal. And I think you're echoing that message that the Director Tedros from WHO said this morning at the reconvened session at WHA 73, was fully supporting both the waiver and at the same time urging much more cooperation, especially with the CTAP mechanism for technology pool. So Yuan, I'd like to move on to you now. MSF, and particularly the Access Campaign, has had a lot of to say on these issues. Clearly, you know, from the ground as well, what's the situation on access, but also, you know, what do we need for scaling up, and also where IP can be barriers. So a lot of the questions in people's mind is also, you know, is this already a problem, or are we looking at a future problem? Are there examples already where IP is a barrier currently to those coded technologies? Or is it more of a wait approach? Let's wait for the technologies to come out and then worry about how do we get access? If you can give us your views on that.
Thank you very much, Viviana. Thank you for the opportunity. So yeah, from our observation in MSF, there are existing and future issues of IP that need to be addressed. Some of the speakers already mentioned before, since the pandemic, there has been a concrete shortage of supply. But if we focus on the therapeutics and vaccines, there are concrete examples already. So we have been following, for instance, the therapeutics pipeline development, and we know the WHO accelerator ACTA therapeutic pillar also constantly update the priority product, and medicines MedPol database have already included many patent information of that. From those information, we can see some of the priority candidates that WHO and us and people are following are widely patented already in low and middle income countries. For instance, just a very few example, we look at 3 products that has been recently prioritized by the ACTA, 2 antiviral medicine. One is from Merck called MK4482, the code of the medicine. From the information we got publicly, it's the patent, the basic patent of this medicine have been filed in at least 20 low and middle income countries, and also a couple of high income countries. And another candidate, priority candidate, followed by the ACTA, named 8527, held by a company. And then the base compounds patent and a few secondary patents have already been filed and granted in at least 50 low and middle income countries: Australia, Canada, Japan, and before the European Patent Office. There are also a number of biological medicine for therapeutics, monoclonal antibody medicine the patent has been widely filed or granted in more than 40 low and middle income countries. We can share a table of those data after the briefing with you, summarized from the MassPod database. That shows that there's already, if now the government and the stakeholders talking about be prepared, once the product come into pipeline, then we can wrap up. Then we know for the therapeutics, there are existing and massive capacity actually in developing countries. Many countries can very quickly started developing and produce many of those therapeutics, chemical drugs, and including biological medicines. The key is that those who have capacity to quickly develop and produce will not be blocked by monopoly backed up by patent. So we also see how company restrictively exercising their patent rights with no difference between a pandemic and non-pandemic. So one of the typical example is remdesivir, when the company Gilead, we know, issued a very restrictive voluntary license. Of course, the medicine itself may not be working because of the recent trial data show, but the IP management of Gilead really shows a negative example, because many developing countries who have manufacturing capacity are excluded. And then many developing countries, especially Latin American countries, who suffer from high infection rate are excluded. So when we talk about global access, relying on companies' willingness is not really working. For vaccines as well, we see the emerging pipeline, so there's news of data coming in different candidates. But then we are also following two levels of information. One is the background IP. Many of the technology platform used by the vaccine developers nowadays are previous technology developed before the pandemic that was used to develop other vaccines. Many of those technologies are still under patent. So we also started gathering information of the patent numbers, and I can share with the organizer after the briefing, so we can share with the participants to have a look. So there is a kind of a number, quite a considerable number of patented technology before the pandemic that are needed to develop vaccine now. What's mattered for that is when we see many companies are entering into bilateral negotiation, bilateral licensing, they have to make sure they have the full right to use and produce those background technology. But to what extent it is guaranteed, we don't really know. One of, or the only actually licensing agreement that has been partially disclosed nowadays is between AstraZeneca and the Fiocruz in Brazil. But if we look at what has been disclosed, it's not totally clear what kind of rights Fiocruz obtained from AstraZeneca in terms of IP, because those terms are not disclosed, considered as a commercial confidentiality. So again, relying on AstraZeneca's willingness to say, open the technology for Brazilian to produce is not really reliable. And the license also only allow Fiocruz to supply Brazil. So if we see bilateral license could maybe contribute to the region, it doesn't because it doesn't allow Fiocruz to supply beyond Brazil. So those are the observations we have so far. And the previous experience with vaccine also shows that the industry has been applying for a patent at every single step of the vaccine development, from the basic research to the production process and the product. And more concerning is the way how vaccine is going to be used. For instance, nowadays we hear a lot of discussion of COVID vaccine. We may need 2 doses of schedule in order to sustain the efficacy. The 2-dose schedule itself as a method of immunizing people have been subject to patent in the past on other vaccines. Although many of the new applications are not visible because of the 18 months period for publication, but if those type of secondary patent on vaccine use are allowed in the future,
how much governments are able to control is really a question. So many developing countries, it's probably really impractical to follow this huge portfolio of patenting on vaccine when we are talking about open up of technology and ramping up of tech production. So I will probably stop here. And we also have a new publication on voluntary license, summarizing our experiences in the past 15 years when voluntary license was used on chemical medicines. And we summarize at least 11 typical terms that could restrict competition and manufacture in developing countries, including, for instance, I mean, the typical one is restriction on the geographic scope where the medicine can be produced and supplied, and very importantly, restriction on the raw material. Where can people source and produce the raw material? Those will have a concrete impact on the scope of the product producers and the price in the end. We also see a restricted term. For instance, some countries are included in license, but the license term says company in those countries can produce but cannot supply their domestic population. So in the pandemic, this is very unethical if we have that kind of term in the voluntary license. And so those kind of restricted use of license will not fit the purpose in the pandemic in our view. Therefore, we think the waiver proposal really provided a way forward for government to seek a collective action and to seek a more automatic and expedited solution, so that those tricky kind of practices of the company in managing their IP based on voluntary willingness will not become a barrier in the near future.
Thank you, Yuan. And I think you exposed very well that in a pandemic framework, what we would have liked to see is very early on, much more collaboration, much more putting together all capacities around the world, effective technology transfer. So rather than have confidential agreements on a bilateral basis and people struggling, even those companies that can do, trying to struggle to get agreements, which no one knows what they contain as strict regulations, we would have liked to see something else. So we're still at the moment where the urgency is great. We know that some vaccines are going to be coming out and it's very restricted in terms of who will be getting doses. So developing countries have enormous concerns about when and if they will be able to access sufficient doses. So if there is a way to accelerate these processes, in particular technology transfer, to facilitate production of effective vaccines, once we see what's coming out, then that would be extremely helpful to deal with the continued pandemic. In that sense, the waiver does present, as you mentioned, that pathway to at least deal with some of the barriers. Of course, there's many, as many of the panelists have mentioned, and yourself, but this is just one barrier less that would create a lot of legal certainty, I think many mentioned as well, to help scale up those efforts and really bring more transparency into what can be done multilaterally. And let's hope with the changing tides politically, that might also assist in this process. So the waiver remains on the table, as we've heard from our panel, and it's seeking additional support so that this can really be mobilized in the next TRIPS Council session reconvened, that as our state of play. So at this point, I'd just like to, of course, thank all our panelists who've made this discussion quite interesting, I think, for everyone listening. And I'd like to now just invite our participants, if you'd like to pose questions, you can do that either through the chat, or you might also just wish to use the hand function. If you prefer to pose the question, then I will just look out for the hand function to give you the floor. So we have about 20 minutes for that interactive discussion, so feel free to come in. If you can just please introduce yourself and the mission, and I will be stopping the recording now to ensure that you feel quite comfortable that this will not be quoted at all, so we can have this frank conversation. So I'm just looking at if there are any hands raised or any comments on the chat from our participants. When you look at the participant list, you'll find the hand function if you'd like to ask for the floor.
Situation that we can envisage. So when it comes to TRIPS flexibilities, it doesn't impose any additional barriers, but it certainly works with flexibilities. It makes it easier to invoke the flexibilities. And certainly, I think as some of the co-panelists would have said, it also creates new opportunities to address existing barriers that we may have. Very important going forward. I think that the message also embedded in this waiver proposal is that countries that have not yet implemented TRIPS flexibilities must do so, must continue to do so, must continue to update their laws, and must continue to implement policies that allow the flexibilities to work not only in the health context, but more broadly. And so from that perspective, part of the waiver is also assessing whether or not alternative approaches such as voluntary licensing would be sufficient. We have said that the waiver also is complementary in respect of any voluntary processes. Why? Because the waiver will allow more people to produce more of the products, more of the medicines, more of the vaccines that would be required to scale up to such a level that everyone that needs access will get access in good time. And so it is not just a question of building capacity, but building that capacity in a very short period of time so that we are able to save lives. And so what we see in terms of the voluntary approaches, that is a good start, but it is not essentially the end of the road. It is maybe the start of something, and certainly part of a lot of the debate that we see around voluntary processes is the concept of philanthropy. Now, philanthropy is good in a certain way, but for us to build permanent capacity beyond this particular pandemic, because there will be other pandemics, we must invest in local resources, we must invest in technology transfer and capacity building. And so from this point of view, the waiver also makes it possible to contemplate these issues. Viviana, as you rightly pointed out, many of these licensing agreements are opaque. They are not, a lot of the information is not in the public domain. And so it may sound like a lot of doses if one company in a country can produce 1 billion doses. If it is for a country like India, for example, and the licensing conditions are limited only to India or to Brazil or to South Africa for that matter, it does not address the urgent need to public access. Also, the issue of IP rights as public goods has come to the forefront. Governments have put out billions and billions of dollars, but governments have not publicly said that companies should be subject to certain limitations. And so there's a lot of good ideas around how we deal with initiatives, medicines, vaccines, technology that benefit from government support. And so going forward, we need to think more deeply about these particular issues. And then naturally, we have to reform our IP systems. We cannot allow patents to be granted automatically without examination. Second-use patents, especially in this context, should be limited. So from that point of view, Viviana, the waiver is really the start of a reform process that we hope can happen, the start of a consensus that we can build for a more inclusive society, for a society where lives matter more than profit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustaqim. Gurleen, would you like to say something?
Yeah, thank you, Viviana. I think Mustaqim has very clearly highlighted what we are seeking to achieve from the waiver. I would just like to clarify a few additional points that have previously been raised by members. So some people have doubts as to how the waiver will be implemented. So I just wanted to clarify that this waiver we are seeking for all WTO members, and then it is optional for a member to choose the extent to which it wants to incorporate the waiver in its national legislation. So the application of the waiver does not invalidate the existing IP rights. It just, seeks to that these IP rights become unenforceable during the waiver period, which is a temporary short period that the General Council will agree to. Second thing, as Mustaqim highlighted, that there is no contradiction or overlap between the waiver and the existing TRIPS flexibilities. So those countries which have the capacity to use compulsory licenses and other TRIPS flexibilities can continue to use them. Similarly, those members who are eligible for other waivers from TRIPS agreement can continue to use those waivers. There's no contradiction whatsoever with this waiver proposal. As also Mustaqim and Yuan have highlighted, that how voluntary licensing approaches are insufficient to deal with the pandemic of this scale and magnitude. I would also like to stress here that we have had many members who spoke about millions and billions of dollars of contributions to the ACT Accelerator of the WHO. So regarding this initiative, I wanted to say, so what I get from this initiative is it seeks to procure 2 billion doses of vaccine by the end of next year and then distribute them fairly around the world. So if we go by the current studies with the 2-dose regime of vaccines, this will only cover 1 billion people. And moreover, only half of those doses are slated for developing countries. So that means even if the ACT Accelerator is fully financed and successful, even then there would not be enough vaccines for the developing world. And then we have emerging reports that many developed countries, which represent only 13% of the world's population, have already bought up more than half of the total likely production of the volumes of leading candidate vaccines. So this further weakens the ACT Accelerator initiative. So clearly it is apparent that such voluntary initiatives, including the COVAX initiative, are not sufficient to address COVID-19 pandemic, and we need this waiver to have an effective response and a timely access in each country of the world to the prospective, to the vaccines and therapeutics that are going to emerge. Thank you.
That this is also a call for developing countries to fully implement the TRIPS flexibilities. So at this point, we found that in some countries, the way in which, for instance, compulsory licenses have been implemented is not enough to act in a timely manner. So I think this is also a great opportunity to look again, to review national laws and to see what improvements need to be implemented in order to ensure that these tools are available when health crises like this or other situations arise. So thank you very much for your participation. As Viviana said, we are available for any further question on this, and certainly we hope that the waiver will get much more support at the next meeting, and then all the WTO members may benefit from this policy space that will be created through it. Thank you.